I'm going to introduce our panel very, very briefly. It may be that in my presentation I'm slightly misrepresenting what we're going to say, but I will tell you. In the case of Oladele here, he's going to be reading a couple of papers by his colleagues at Olabisi, Onabanjo University in Nigeria. We will start with Professor Baruti Katembo, who is a mathematician and an independence scholar. And the title of his talk is, which I must say I find kind of intriguing, is Connecting the Tree Trunk and Branches for Development, Which Way for the 21st Century Africa. We'll be giving each of the participants about 15 minutes, okay?
Thank you, everyone, for having me to speak, and good afternoon to everybody. As Professor Sharp told you, the title is Connecting the Tree Trunk and Branches for Development, Which Way for 21st Century Africa. You'll see that there was another presenter with me, David Akombo, who's an assistant professor of music at Weber State University. He couldn't be here today. He had a job interview conflict that was unavoidable. So I'm going to go ahead and fill in for both of us. I'd like to start out by saying that Africa and its people have for a long time been viewed as being low on the totem pole, if I may use such a term, in both socioeconomic measures and indicators, whether it be high life expectancy, economic viability, good governance, whether it be advanced democracies, etc. And many people have seen Africa as being a place of war, famine, government corruption, economic mismanagement, among other ills. And today the continent, the African continent, finds itself kind of the footstool of many industrialized nations, whether it be the EU, United States, Japan, recently China, who are all after getting natural resources from it. But the continent has a great deal of resources, but has not been able to capitalize on the enormous resources and potential for its own growth, particularly in the post-colonial period. And that leads me into the main heart of what is being talked about here, and that is the ideas of Pan-Africanism as launched from the voices and faces in the mid-20th century of people like Du Bois and Nkrumah, Malcolm X, Julius Nyerere, some of the champions of a vision in which Africa would be able to use its resources collectively because its people would see itself as one with a common journey, common history. It's just not been realized as yet. And so, because of slave trade, colonialism, which has been damaging to the continent, it's been piecemeal in terms of putting itself back together. So the idea of connecting the tree trunk and the branches, basically in metaphor, the tree trunk really stands for Africa, the heart and soul of really the human family, but in this particular case, African people, and the branches in this case are going to be some assets that I'm going to talk about that needs to be utilized and reconnected for overall empowerment. We've got to reverse some of the things that have been going on and go in a new direction for the 21st century and build upon successes of the past, new visions of the future, and also minimizing some mistakes of the past. The three major resource areas that I want to highlight are going to be music and culture. That's one. The African diaspora, that's two. And And the third item is what is called regional economic integration. David Akombo, who was the co-presenter, was primarily going to take on the idea about the music and culture. He's an ethnomusicologist, but I'll just fill in briefly in that regard. For example, when we say music and culture, there's some items that people of African descent and the continent can use to help bridge unity and help bridge a spirit of camaraderie. Be things like food, musical instruments, drums, festivals that can be shared by many peoples across ethnic lines, across geographical spaces. Because I think that even in the spreading out of the diaspora, a lot of the African foods, ways of preparing foods, whether it be yams, whether it be watermelon, whether it be playing different kinds of drums, etc., all African. On my way over here to the college yesterday, by the hotel van, someone pointed out that they saw on the ground a few guinea fowl. They said, wow, guinea fowl found here in Texas? And I said, yes. I said, because guinea fowl was a bird, an animal, that's indigenous to Africa, that was put on board slave ships to feed slaves and also brought as products in the Western Hemisphere. So a lot of things that are here, as I said, yams, different kinds of peanuts, certain species of cattle, guinea fowl, bananas, cassava, all those things in the United States and in South America were all coming from Africa a long time ago. So I just want to point out that the connection should be made. The next area that I wanted to say something about was the idea about economic integration. I think that we're talking about reconnecting regions to have resources for intercollaborative trade, intercollaborative partnerships. I think the EAC, the East African Community, is a great model for this idea. That means the overall umbrella that is connecting geopolitically Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, and Burundi under kind of auspices in which they're sharing ideas, trying to make borderless communities, currency sharing, using Swahili and English as the major languages across the region, and getting people to try to see themselves as East African as opposed to I'm Kenyan, I'm Tanzania, or break it down to the ethnic groups. I think this is extremely important as a resource that the continent can use as a model for other regions of the continent to duplicate and customize to its making. When it comes to the African diaspora, for example, the United States represents the African diaspora and represents Africa itself. One of the major hubs right here in the United States is Minneapolis, Minnesota, that has virtually most of the different countries of Africa represented right there in this hub. But if you break down the United States into indigenous African people who have been here a long time, known as African Americans, recent immigrants from the Caribbean, South America, and Africa, if you put all of these different peoples together, it collectively represents Africa. So why can't this resource be used to work together in this space and place? I mean, right now, we're bringing lots of African people together and others, but in this case, an African conference to talk about Africa's positioning in the world today politically in terms of a theme. We're talking about Africa right here in the middle of Texas. So we don't have to talk about Africa just on the continent. Africa is wherever people are discussing it and its problems, its successes, failures, and its growth. So that should be used as a resource to get together. But first, we're going to have an idea about Pan-Africanism when it comes to people who are living right here to get together, to blend together, and then to use the leverage here to re-affect America's geopolitical policies and foreign policy toward Africa and help the continent itself trade, research, development, exchange of ideas. And the last one was the area of what's it, the diaspora? No, those were the three. Actually, I covered them. So it's going to be a reciprocal relationship that the diaspora helps the continent helps the diaspora. We need to make sure that that's done. And so I'll just conclude by saying I don't think that Africa needs the diaspora, for example, just to come as like a workforce need to help build Africa. No. It should be what I would call a participatory resource to help in its development, so that we can rebuild a source of strength for us, so that Africa is not low, but African people are not low because their homeland is not low, and therefore it's a reciprocal relationship of empowerment in the 21st century. Thank you.
You actually had 7 minutes left.
7 minutes left? Can I?
If you want to keep going, Baruti.
Yes, just a couple of comments, if I may say. I think that making the mistakes of the past have got to be avoided, and one of the mistakes of the past is tribalism and ethnic division. And I should say and bear witness that the diaspora in the numbers that are in the Western Hemisphere, meaning Central America, South America, Caribbean, and North America, would not be here in these numbers had it not been, obviously, for the massive slave trade that was involved on both sides of Africa and in the middle, meaning West Coast, East Coast, and Central. And a large part of the slave trade was aided and abetted by various African administrators who, for varying reasons, helped Europeans and Arabs in their business dealings to sell other black people into slavery across economic lines and ethnic lines. And I think that needs to be stated. And so mistrust, distrust, disliking other groups because of warring factions, ethnic tribalism, etc., has got to be eradicated. So that's one area that needs to be concentrated on to eradicate that. I think the mindset and ideas of Pan-Africanism to begin to see stress and commonalities of people who stretch across various tongues, who stretch across various languages, who stretch across various geographies. You see a people who have a common destiny, hopefully a common history, overrides ethnic division. And when I mentioned the EAC, I think that's a great model that can be reduplicated. And those things being reduplicated around the world in other forms, like the EU. I mean, the only thing the EU is pan-Europeanism. And even though the EAC predated the EU in the 1970s and fell apart and has been relaunched, the idea still is that unity is a form of empowerment and progression for large groups of people in a geographic space or a common history.
Great, thank you. Oladele Balogun is going to read a couple of papers by his colleagues. What I thought we would do is I would have Oladele read one of the papers, and then I would turn to Professor Yusuf to read hers, and then we will come back to him. I'll give you your voice a break. Okay. The first paper that Oladele will read, as I understand it, concerns strategies for development within the so-called developing African nations. This is a paper written by Oluwole Adeola Adinugba, who is at the Olabisi Onabanjo University in Nigeria. Okay.
The chair, co-panelists, and colleagues, as you have been rightly told, I'm reading on behalf of Adenugba Adeola. The title of the paper is African Nations, Strategies for Achieving Significant Development. The paper delves into the historical epoch of African nations, stating the different stages and phases of their struggle for development. It identifies some fundamental factors impeding the development of African nations in the past and present, among which includes illiteracy, bad governance, colonialism, and lack of access to technologies that can aid development. This paper argues that though African nations had outgrown some of these factors impeding development in the past, yet African nations are still developing, while some are underdeveloped because they have not achieved significant degree of industrialization relative to their population. Reorientation, identification with the positive aspect of our culture, good governance, and discipline, this paper suggests are some of the strategies by which African nations can truly record significant development. The paper argues that continuous lamentation about our undeveloped situation without a conscious effort in our various capacities to make a difference will not take us far. Instead, African nations will remain a mediocre in the world affairs. Development is a social concept standing for the process through which human beings strive to improve the conditions of their lives. Development has two broad dimensions, namely the tangible or technical aspect and the intangible or moral aspect.
The talk is transcending elitist approach and making a paradigm shift from growth without development to populist development. What I understood from this, you can correct me, is what matters to Africans.
Thank you, the chair, fellow presenters, and colleagues. As the topic has said, I want to go straight to presentation, and I say that every generation and historical epoch produces its own set of small number of men and women who are initiators of fundamental change in the society. They are usually forerunners of creative ideas, innovations, and inventions. They champion development as well as venture into leadership in order to practically demonstrate how these new ideas could be implemented. Post-independent Africa indeed produced its own set of elements. However, the historical epoch that gave birth to them, particularly the ravaging capitalist system and the prevailing international economic order, not only affected their conceptualization of issues, but their ability to move the region progressively forward. The continent has therefore been drifting when compared with other regions that had similar features. In more than 5 decades ago, the drifting has been so acute that the pace of development, its quality, and the interest of such development has continued to generate interest of scholars and friends of the continent. The question I ask is, when you talk about development, what are you trying to say? Are you talking development in the face of what you as an individual or the continent as a body thinks is development to them? Or are you looking at development in the picture of the Western world where we think is fully developed? At independence, the international community had high hope for some of the nations in the continent because of vast populations, mineral and agricultural potentials, the discovery of oil in a country like Nigeria, the growing mining industry in South Africa, to mention but a few, gave credence to this hope. However, this has remained a mirage because of that of very little leadership, emotional competence among many of the post-colonial leaders of the region. I talk about emotional intelligence and I say, to what extent are leaders in Africa emotionally competent to be leaders and to achieve development for their own people. And when I talk about emotional intelligence competence, I'm talking about the ability to carry along the people for whom you are talking development, the ability to be a team worker and not a dictator, the ability to read into what type of development your own people need, and not just borrowing ideas from other sectors of the world. The paper argued that to the majority of people on the African continent, these are just concepts. What matters to them is access to health, and when I talk about these concepts, I'm talking about various concepts like developing, underdeveloped, the term third world, then least developed. These are concepts. How did they develop? In most cases, because they are ideologically loaded, and at times an attempt drawn from scholars' attempts to draw a parallel line between approach to development in the industrialized capitalist nation of the world and their former colonies. So you now see a scholar coming up with the term or concept that Nigeria is, or maybe Africa is a third world, or it's a developing nation, or is an underdeveloped nation. These are concepts that just come out of our attempts to explain our level of development, but basically as a result of a comparative analysis to other parts of the world. And I say that this paper argues that the majority of the people on the African continent, to them, these are just concepts. What matters to the typical African is access to healthcare facilities, good education, improved economy, and other infrastructural facilities. So, if you say industrialized world, if you say the developed world, to a typical African, it doesn't really mean anything. As long as you're not talking about how I can get improved health care services, as long as you're not talking about how I can get improved education, as long as you're not talking about an improvement in the economic status of I as an individual and then my nation. So once we're talking about development and you're not talking about what concerns me or what I see as development, then you are just borrowing concepts. And then by the time you say I'm underdeveloped or developing, I want to ask, in what areas am I developing? So the paper looked at development since independence in some African countries, which include South Africa, Tanzania, Egypt, and Nigeria, in critical areas of food security, human capital development, infrastructural development, and positive attitudinal change. So what we tried to do in the paper is to see the level of food security in this four nations of Africa, and to what extent are we be able to develop the human capital in these nations, and what is the level of the infrastructural development of these nations, and then we ask the positive attitudinal change that these nations need in order to attain the type of development they want for themselves, and not just looking at development from the perspective of the other continents of the world. In conclusion, the paper concludes that compared to some Asian tigers like Singapore and Malaysia, a lot needs to be done. Some leadership with the right attitude is crucial to development. The paper proposes transparent leadership with the right emotional intelligence competence that will drive the system by emphasizing teamwork and selfless service. That's the summation of our paper.